At one point, our battalion, along with another battalion, got orders to escort a group of ships that were going up a canal. We were told that there were lots of mines on the bank of the canals, and therefore we should stay well off, about 100 feet, 100 yards, well back off the canal. We moved out on the operation, and during that first day, late in the afternoon, one of our Vietnamese soldiers stepped on a mine, and we called for helicopter medevac. It was dark, and they asked not to come in unless it was essential. We checked. The fellow seemed in good shape, and therefore we told him if he'd come back in the morning. I went to sleep at night, woke up the next morning to check about the soldier in the medevac, and the soldier had died during the night. So I was pretty upset that that had happened. We moved out on our canal, and at one point I could tell that the ships, the boats, had gotten way ahead of us. I felt like they were way ahead of us, and we were no longer providing security for them. And I went to the bank of the canal. There were trees thick on the bank because nobody had been down there long. And you had to lean out, holding on to the trees, look up the canal. And I saw that the boats were way ahead of us. And I had walked out on this one route and looked, and I'd been pretty careful walking out there. And when I turned around to go back, as I was moving swiftly along the same route, I stepped on a mine. Nowadays they call them IEDs, I guess, improvised explosive devices. Anyway, this thing went off, all kind of smoke, and knocked me off of the dike I was walking on and down into the water on the side, into the rice paddy. I was conscious. I remember seeing something come up out of the ground, and there was the explosion, giving a lot of gunpowder smell, and I knew somebody would hear me, and I started waving my cap to let people know. They made their way toward me, and they, of course, I'm sure, were very leery of this whole situation, too. But they got me, a fellow by the name of Floyd McAfee, who was a big football player. He and I had commanded companies. He commanded D Company, I commanded C Company in the 101st. Anyway, he carried me piggyback until we could get a point where we could get down to the canal, and then they put me on one of the boats we'd called back. And we went along the canal until we found a good space for the helicopter to come in, call for a medevac, and it was getting on 5 o'clock or so when the medevac picked me up to take me into Saigon. Remember, we landed on a soccer field, interrupted a soccer game, not with a big crowd there, but some people watch it. Ambulance roaring took me to the hospital there, which was in Cholon at the time, and I had a pretty miserable night. I smelled bad, not only body stink, but the smell of the gunpowder was strong in there. I remember the people in the hospital talking about the smell. I really wasn't paying much attention to it, but I was anxious to get looked at, get worked on, and then I was tired, and they got me to a room, and I got into the room after they had worked on me, and I got sort of a partial sleep that night. The next morning, about 6:30, I guess, I heard somebody say, "Where's Captain Crittenden?" And I thought to myself, who knows I'm here? I didn't know anybody even knew I was here. And I looked at the door, and it was General Westmoreland who came in. And, of course, he got on his desk each morning a list of any activities, and the revisers weren't a large number of us there at the time. Anyway, he came in. He asked me what happened. I told him what had happened, and he talked about him hitting a mine in Germany during World War II. And it happened there was an NCO in the room who I had served with before. He was also in the 101st, and General Westmoreland knew him. So that all of us were ex-101st people. Westmoreland talked to him a minute, too, before he left. But it was quite a surprise to find the deputy commander at the time, General Westmoreland, come in to visit me. I was in the hospital, I think, 18, 20 days, and then I was released on crutches, and I went back down to Mito, to the division headquarters. And there I worked in the S3 section, and I couldn't get around, couldn't move. I could sit at a table and help them in the best way I could. I did stay in the S3 section, and while in the S3 section, I remember they had a ceremony, and I was awarded the Purple Heart. And I worked in the S3 as hard as I could, trying to be of use there on crutches. I gradually recovered and got in pretty good shape and was able to walk a little bit, though I was being careful all the time as I walked. One afternoon late, we had an operation going on in the Quinhua province, where Binh Tre, just south of Mito. We heard a lot of frantic radio calls being made. and we could listen and see that the unit was in trouble. And I guess it quieted down maybe 8 or 9 at night. I went on to bed. And later that night, they woke me up and said, "Do you think your foot's in good enough shape to go down and explore that site, see what happened in this contact that we had tonight?" And I said, "Yes, I think I am." He said, "Well, we'll have a jeep, weapons, and a driver ready for you real early in the morning. It was before dawn." Got up, the jeep driver was there, had all the equipment, weapons, ammunition, and so forth. We got on the jeep, went down, caught a ferry across with a lot of farmers with all the cattle and chickens and everything going across, and I guess they were going to market. We got across, went about 5 miles south of Mito, and then turned to the west. And we went 3 or 4 miles, and I don't remember exact distance, but I had a good map of where this thing had taken place. We stopped the jeep. I got out, started walking on a trail that went north. I'd come south, then going west, and then it was turned and was going north up this trail. This had been a road before at one time, but the bridges had been blown out on it, and it became gradually grown over, and it was really just a single trail. And I would go a little way down the trail, and then I would stop and listen to see if I could hear anything. I knew I had a good map, but I knew where this contact had taken place, and I knew it was going to be bad when I got there. I would walk away, and then I would stop and listen and look to see what I could see, and it was dead quiet. Sun had beginning to come up. Walk a few more steps, listen. Walk a little further, listen. The driver had stayed with the jeep at the road, and I got to a point where I thought I could see a body on the trail. And I got a little closer and stopped again and looked a little further, and I saw that it was the captain that was there. There was only one captain. His name was Chico Stone, and I'd known him before. I remembered somebody had sent him an Uzi submachine gun. He was very proud of it. He had the ammunition and a weapon. I looked all around, and I could not see the Uzi. I knew that they had taken that. One thing that surprised me is captain's bars were still on. They hadn't taken those. So after I checked over him a little bit, I saw that along the trail and off to the direction I was walking, off to the right, there were a number of additional bodies, and one of those was Lieutenant Coyle. And I went down and checked him. I remember a couple of things about that. His hands were in a real grotesque configuration, and also they had unpacked his pack on his stomach and left the things in there. They were hunting for something. And I remember there was a pair of West Point swim trunks with the gold, gray, and black colors, I remember. And so then I went on further. This was taking a lot of time to look through because I had no idea where these people were. Went down the trail further, and way off on the left side of the trail, I found Lieutenant Reagan. I didn't see any injuries to him at all. I knew he was dead, of course, and I thought that he'd been shot, but it had not disfigured his body at all. And then I found Sergeant Ward in a pagoda. I'd probably been there an hour and a half looking because there were lots of other Vietnamese bodies. I went back to the road, and I suspect I made a call back. I don't remember exactly what happened. But about 9 o'clock, the regimental advisor came out, and I walked him through the we didn't call it an ambush. Ambush was a term of shame, and so we referred to it as a contact. Now, if you read some articles these days on this thing, it talks about an ambush, but we never used that term. I suspect about 9 in the morning, the regimental advisor got there. As I said, I walked him through, and then we went back, sat down, talked about the situation. He left, and then probably 11 or so, the division senior advisor, Colonel Nimothy, came. And I told him I had found the Americans and the others, and I could show him. And he said, good. He says, well, where is Lieutenant Reagan? I said, sir, well, I'll take you to him. So we stopped along the way as I went. And there was Chico Stone and Lieutenant Coyle. I stopped there for a minute, and he asked me again, well, where's Lieutenant Reagan? And I said, sir, I'll go next to him. As we went along, and I turned off the trail to go to where Reagan's body was, there came some Vietnamese soldiers with a stretcher, and on it was Lieutenant Reagan. Well, I remember the colonel grabbed Reagan's hand, and he said, cold, cold. And we asked him to put the stretcher down, and he said, well, how did he get killed? And I said, sir, I don't know. I didn't check him. He said, well, let's unbutton his shirt and let's look. And we did. We unbuttoned his shirt, and in there, it looked like there were some stabs. You didn't see it in his shirt. The fatigues were dirty and so forth. so I didn't notice it until it was on his body. But it looked like he'd been stabbed several times after he had passed, because where the knife comes out, it leaves a little sort of a white meat area around it that was not bloody looking. And he said, well, do you see a gunshot in there? I said, no, sir, I don't. It might have been there, but we didn't see it. So he said, all right, let's put his shirt back on. And he had this terrific interest, Colonel Nimothy did, in Reagan. After that, we got his shirt back on, got him put back together. By the way, I'll mention here in an article once that he was shot in the head and neck. We certainly didn't see that. But anyway, we left, went to Sergeant Ward, and then he departed the area, Colonel Nimothy did, and he said, well, write these people up for awards. And I did the best I could. We avoided the term ambush because, as I said, that was a term of shame. If you got ambushed, it meant you didn't have proper security out and other things. They had been going in on the operation to resupply a post that had been under attack, and then they came out the same route. And we teach people not to travel the same route in as out, and it somehow doesn't sink. Over and over, I saw this happen in Vietnam. Another good buddy of mine was killed doing the same thing, coming out the same route that he had gone in on, and they had been ambushed. About midday, I went back. A number of Vietnamese soldiers had come in, and they were bringing the bodies back out to the trail, and the sun was coming up, and the stench was terrible from that. Also, helicopters had come in and picked up the Americans and taken them to Saigon. I went back to the post, and then went back to the seminary, and I began to write up the work. About 2 months later, Maxwell Taylor had become the ambassador to Vietnam, and he came down to visit our division. We had a new division senior advisor, and I remember the division senior advisor was very uptight about this visit. What was to happen, he was to learn about the operations there, and he had particularly asked to get a briefing on this operation that we had down in Quien Hoa province. And so I remember in a room upstairs, I had an easel set up in one corner and 2 chairs in front. The colonel sat there, and Maxwell Taylor, Ambassador Maxwell Taylor, not General Maxwell Taylor at that time. And I gave probably a 20-minute briefing, and I guess I got some questions. I don't remember anything of note, and he got up and left. After the time of the operation, and sometime later, this thing, after some press, it began to learn about what had gone on there. It was titled The Bloodiest 60 Minutes of the War. We didn't use that title, and it wasn't 60 minutes. It was about an hour and a half. But at any rate, there were a number of articles that you can read. Always wondered what the connection was between Colonel Nimothy and Lieutenant Reagan. And I don't know to this day, except that maybe Reagan was married to the daughter of the commandant of the Citadel. And maybe Colonel Nimothy had known him and therefore was trying to get in touch with him and tell him what had happened to his son-in-law. Reagan was buried in Arlington, and years later, I looked on the Arlington cemetery set up on the internet, and I looked at his stone, and it had the names and so forth, and on the back, it had the name of his daughter, who had died at 1 year old, about 6 months after Reagan had died, I believe, about that amount of time. That wife had one tough time. Her husband had died. Her husband's child, who he had not seen, died a few months after he did. She had had a tough year, and when you talk about military families having bad times, and it's not only the soldiers, it's as well the families during these combat situations.